Podcast by Friday, episode 23. You don't want to be held hostage by one by accident, so you want to look into the terms of use of each one of these to find out how easy it would be for you to take your files and go somewhere else. Podcast by Friday with Bill Griggs and Kingsley Grant. We help people to create their minimal viable podcast by taking bold action to defeat procrastination and to get their voices heard.
I'm Kingsley Grant.
And I'm Bill Griggs.
And you're listening to
Podcast by Friday.
Hey, Bill, it's great seeing you again as we get into recording our weekly podcast. How's things going out there in that upstate New York?
Things are wonderful here, Kingsley. It's great to be back here for another episode of Podcast by Friday. We're in a cold snap right now. It's gone into the 40s, and that's unusual for May. But
that's crazy. I mean, it's like, I guess it's one of those crazy weather that some people, it's all over the place. It's like, man, sometimes it's how life is, right? All over the place and unpredictable, and podcasting world is unpredictable. I guess it's just part of the whole idea of the unpredictableness of the world we're living in, right?
Hey, I never complain about it because, when it's nice and cold outside, people sit down, get a warm blanket around them, plug in their earbuds, and listen to our podcast. And it's fine with me. Gives you plenty of time for that instead of being out and doing other things.
It's so crazy because here in South Florida, where I'm at, people are on the beach and they're trying to find a way to get under a shade or, in the water. And here you are trying to find a way to get warm. It's just crazy how, here we are recording this podcast. We're in two different parts of the world, so to speak, different temperature experience. But, it's great that we can get together like this across the virtual stratosphere.
I'll bet you if you walk down that beach and you looked around, there'd be a lot of folks with earbuds in listening to podcasts or music or whatever it is.
You're right.
It doesn't seem to, that's the cool thing about podcasts is the weather doesn't, it's not the driving factor. Everybody can listen to a podcast no matter what they're doing.
And that's why even as you're tuning in today, listening to us, we want to make sure that you have your earbuds put in properly because we have a great episode today just for you because we are been in a series, right? Well, we've been trying to cover a couple episodes here for our listener.
Oh, yeah. We started back in episode 19 with a series that takes you, the wannabe podcaster, through the steps that we use to launch our podcast very quickly. In fact, we launched ours in 7 days, which is kind of one of the reasons why we call this show the Podcast by Friday show. We're just now telling you our secret sauce, how we got it done.
And I'm really excited about how we've been laying out almost sequentially the steps that a person who want to get their podcast up and been contemplating and procrastinating and whatever they've been doing, we're simply saying, hey, we want you have no excuse to why you should not have your podcast going because we're giving you all that we know that can get you up and running in no time. So kind of catch us up here, Bill, on what we've been covering so far. So
sure.
If you haven't listened to those episodes yet, you might want to go back and listen to them because they're very much helpful. And it's really, we're building up sequentially here where we're in this journey.
Yeah, we told you in episode 19 about some powerful behind-the-scenes website hosting and website building tools that we use to make our life easier when we create our podcast. And if you'd like to listen to that episode, you can just go to podcastbyfriday.com/019. Or 19.
we do have but we want to make sure you're covered. So we have 019 and 19. So 19 and 019.
Yep. So from this
by the way, I think I want to make sure our listeners know because we have this go back and forth on this because sometimes you say you have it as the print the link as 2 digits, right? And I'm saying, oh, but Bill, what about when we get to 100 episodes? Then what do we do then? And so what happened?
Yeah. So it created twice the work. We put it down as 019 and we're just 19. So we got you covered, folks. If you listen to episode 19, you'll be great.
And what I find sometimes that a listener might be in the habit of listening to other podcasts, and they hear either 3 digits or 2 digits, and without even thinking, they go ahead and immediately put that in and probably not find it. So we want to make sure you find it either way. We got you covered, baby. We got you covered. Don't worry about it.
Yep. So then after all of this, back and forth about where the episode is stored, we'll tell you about episode 20 too. By that, I mean episode 20 also.
Yeah. It sounds like episode 22.
Because in episode 20, we talked about the importance of URLs and taglines for the success of your podcast. And that episode can be found at podcastbyfriday.com/20. And it can also be found at podcastbyfriday.com/020. Okay. And moving on to episode 21, we just released this one recently, and it's been doing pretty well so far. It's drag and drop websites for your podcast. So that one's all about shortcutting the website building process. And that can be found at podcastbyfriday.com/021 or 2021. Yeah. So now you've got the numbering system down. I'm just going to say 21 or 22. So
there you go.
Episode 22 is about the podcast cover art, and that's the artwork that you need to submit your podcast to iTunes and to get it up on other services. And you can find that one at podcastbyfriday.com/21.
There you go. And so today
excuse me, I screwed that up.
That's 20. That's 22.
It's episode 22, not 21.
That's right. See, that's why I'm telling you. Here we go. Slow it down. 022 and episode 21. So we got that down. We got you covered, and we're in for a great time. We have fun doing this, as you can hear, because we wanted to make certain that you recognize we are people who do have these conversations. We do sometimes not agree about certain things, and it's part of life. But
Sure.
We're great friends, and we want to make sure that you understand that you're listening to people who are we are just raw and authentic as you hear us. It's, you get what you sign up for.
Yeah, we don't edit out a lot of the bloopers or mistakes from our podcast because these things happen. Our whole point is to help you to get your podcast launched quickly, and the less editing you do, the quicker that's going to happen. And so, we're human. When we make mistakes, you hear them. That's an added bonus.
I'm telling you. And so Bill, today we are covering podcast media hosting. This is episode 23. And so what is it about media hosting that we want to talk about today that will help our listener realizing, okay, they've talked about the domain, they've gotten that, they've talked about the website and how we cover that again. We talk about how to create the podcast. Where am I with it?
Take a breath, Kingsley. Take a breath.
Yeah, take a breath. Okay, here we go. Let's breathe in. 1. Okay, 2, 3. Good. So, take 2 on this. We've talked about the idea of you creating your podcast, cover art, your audio, but now the question is, where do you store that recording? Where do you store that interview you've done? Where do you store the hard work you've put into getting this audio prepared and ready for your listener? So, Bill, we call that the podcast media hosting solutions.
Yeah. Most people would think, well, I just went out and I bought a website and, that has hosting for everything that I want. I can just take my media files and I can stick them up on my new website and everything will be fine. Folks can find everything in one spot. Like they say, oh, well, it's podcastbyfriday.com. All of their files must be on that website. Well, that is not true. It's actually a recipe for disaster because podcast files, audio files in general, are large in size. And so when your listener goes to find your episode and they go to your website and it's hosted on your website, when they click download or they click stream, all that data gets pulled off of your website, and that can tie up your website. And there's only so much what they call throughput. In other words, there's only so much bandwidth that is available on your website. And if all of that is being drawn down, then your web page starts to load slow and other things happen. So it's actually best to separate where your media is stored from where your website is stored.
And so that's that's one of the main reason I believe you need to host your audio someplace else other than on your platform. Because I think, especially since this weekend I went to a conference, and one of the persons who was presenting from Google, and she said that I think it was 60% of the media consumption is done on mobile, and people are not going to wait around for something to download if it's going to take forever, especially on their mobile device. So I think it's a very important point of not using that as a host in your website. And we talk more about where you can do that later on. But I believe also, too, why do we need a hosting platform is to distribute those audio files across other platforms very smoothly and without you having to do much work. Because, for example, when we distribute our podcast or episode, we send it to other like social media, like Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or YouTube, and that's being distributed from where we are hosting our audio. And it's so much easier to do all of that. And I think it's all integrated within the platform we will mention shortly. But it helps you to get your work out there easier and to a larger audience. And we recommend not doing it on your website for that reason as well.
Yeah, because the other part of this equation is when you put your files on your own website and people start listening to it and you get popular, there are other people who are sharing that server with you. Mm-hmm. And that will make their files slower. And pretty soon the web hosting company will look and say, hey, all of this bandwidth is being used up in Podcast by Friday with all those billions of listeners. We're going to just pull the plug on them, and we're going to take their site down because they're impacting the whole network. And then there's silence on the air because they can't get your files. And then they find out that they bump you up to a much higher cost hosting solution so that you can pull down that kind of bandwidth. So it's much easier to use a service that is custom designed to host media files like we've just discussed. There's one other good reason, Kingsley. And that's to protect yourself against losing your files.
And that is really a very important point, Bill, because I find that when your site goes down, which can happen, and that's where people are accessing your audio, then we just let you figure that out. What happens to them being able to get what you worked so hard for, spend so much time putting together, and now you're telling people to go to your site to get the audio and they can't find it because it's not there.
Yeah.
Your site is down.
Let's take it a step further. What if you decided, hey, I've got a server in my my house. I could just stick all my files up there and people could use them. Well, what if you crash your computer and you lose all your files and you can't replace them? Most of these solutions that we're about to talk about for hosting your media are cloud-based. So you don't have to worry about it because unless the entire internet goes down, your files will still be there.
I just wanted to, go back to my point earlier about the distribution of audio across other platforms. And you mentioned protecting against lost files just now. The lady who was presenting from Google, Bill, mentioned this past weekend as we're listening to her presentation. And when I mentioned about mobile devices and people able to access your files, she said this, that 3.5 billion searches are done every day. Mm-hmm. Every day, Google have recorded. And every second, 40,000 searches happen around the world. So imagine a person, you become very popular, and people are searching for your audio on your site. And now all these people are coming looking for that audio. I mean, your website will be down in a hurry. Mm-hmm. So I think it's so important to go back to the point you're making, that you're going to protect against you're sharing your hosting with your web
hosting
platform, hosting, yeah. And so they will actually say to you, "I'm sorry, you're eating up all this bandwidth. We can't allow you to do that, because you either have to get your own hosting, where to host your website, and
your own
pay
dedicated
megabucks
hosting
for that."
Yeah, dedicated hosting is expensive.
Correct. Yeah, dedicated
for that.
hosting.
So that's why they have these podcast media hosting platforms, and that's why you should use one, because they're designed for this. This is what they were designed for, and they're not terribly expensive, and in some cases they're free. Yeah.
So Bill, I mean, we talk about why they need to host their audio on a platform, and why it's not a good idea to have it on their own website. Well, before we get into telling them what platforms they could use, I'm wondering when should a person start thinking about hosting that audio and the audio file?
Well, it's something that they're going to need to be thinking about almost immediately, and certainly before they submit their files to iTunes or any other syndication network for that matter, because the files already have to be up and accessible. They already have to have their own RSS feed, which is that Real Simple Syndication?
Yes.
RSS feed. It's just another word for a URL that tells the location of your media file on the web. And you need to have those addresses before you can submit to iTunes, which is arguably the largest single source of podcast out there.
I think it's 50% of all podcasts are stored on iTunes. Mm-hmm. I mean, are syndicated through iTunes. And that's really a huge number that I think, and they're going to require you to have some, have your audio hosted someplace before you can even submit to them.
Right. And just having the RSS feed available and hosted will allow you to put it on lots of different syndication networks. I mean, Google has come up with their own syndication network for podcast episodes called Google Play. Mm-hmm. There are a number of other services like that, but the two big gorillas in the room are iTunes and Google Play.
Yeah. So the idea then, Bill, is having decided when they're going to do that. Now, I think we can talk about then the platforms they're going to think about using to store their audio, and the ones that we use and have used for. I mean, I've used, one of these two we're going to mention, or the numbers we're going to mention just now. I've used one of those for many years now and still do. And we've also used that for our Podcast by Friday podcast. Mm-hmm. And we have used Spreaker and Libsyn. So let's talk about those two before we also mention other platforms they can also use.
Sure. Well, we can start out with Spreaker, which is where we're currently hosting Podcast by Friday. I had not heard of Spreaker before I began hosting my podcast, my first podcast, which was CNC Router Tips. I found out about them at the Podcast Movement Conference in Texas, and that was that 2015? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And really nice service that did a lot of things for us. In fact, the ability to get started with Spreaker, you could do live broadcasting back then. which was unheard of. You could record an episode of your podcast live. You could also, upload your pre-recorded episodes there, and the pricing plan was good. In fact, it has a free option, which really suited my frugal nature at the top. But we're now in a paid plan for this podcasting, but it's nice because Spreaker not only lets you upload the file, you can edit it there, and you can syndicate it out to other networks there. Automatically, whenever we load up an episode onto Spreaker, it pumps it out to several other social sharing services, which includes YouTube, Facebook. It also puts it out to SoundCloud, and if we had applied, iHeartRadio. So that's, one of the reasons to use Spreaker. And, we tell you what we're using because that may help you make a decision.
And we have used these for quite some time. I mentioned Libsyn earlier because I found Libsyn to be very user-friendly, and they have very low entry price plan. There's not a free version of Libsyn, but it's like from $5 all the way up to like $75, but you get the storage increases with those price, and you can always go in and figure out what you might want. But I would recommend you could just start if you use Libsyn. And again, we have no affiliation. I want to mention we have no affiliation with these, which you're mentioning. We just think they're very good, and we use them ourselves. So we want to make sure you know that. But from $5 all the way up to $75 for Libsyn, and I've used that with my other podcasts. I've had a number of other podcast shows, and I've used it for many years, and still do up to today. And so it's a great platform. It's one of I think, as a matter of fact, I believe Libsyn is the largest.
Yes, it is.
It is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Libsyn is probably the most popular, largest out there.
It is, yeah. And so it's two we have mentioned because we have used them ourselves. And one thing I found out about Libsyn, I had a problem recently, last few months back, and I was really having a hard time with something with my other show. And I really contacted Libsyn and asked them, could they help me? Because I was hosting my show at the time under another platform, which is called Blubrry, which we mentioned later on. But they were saying if I was hosting the RSS feed through Libsyn and not through another platform, they could help me. So I said, how can I put all my shows through Libsyn and use an RSS feed from there? I was only using Libsyn to host my files, but not putting the RSS feed from there, like you mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. And, it may sound a bit technical for you as you're listening, but don't worry about the technicality piece right now. Listen to what my point is. I contacted Libsyn, and they walk me through step by step, patiently put all my shows. I have about 100 plus shows that I want to bring over, and they just told me how to do it, and it was done in no time, very smoothly, and it's up running running right now. So it's reliable. The customer service is great there. For me, it has been, and so I really highly recommend Libsyn. And I've used Spreaker in the past, but then I kind of used up all my free storage. So I said, okay, I think I don't want to pay the money here and pay Libsyn, so I bring everything over to Libsyn.
Yeah. Now, if our listeners would like to read an article, there was a good article in Huffington Post, 3 Places to Host Your Podcast is the name of the article. And it's by Megan Barnes Finkelstein. So
at least you can pronounce the name.
So rather than make you try and search that, we'll just stick a link in the show notes to 3 Places to Host Your Podcast in Huffington Post. It's a good article, good read there. They mentioned SoundCloud, Libsyn, and Podbean in that episode, in that article. There's also other articles out there that we can talk about later or not. So.
Yeah, and even the link to the Libsyn pricing, we'll have it in the show notes at podcastbyfriday.com/23. You'll be able to find the links as Bill mentioned in the show notes, you can go there and just click right there. So make it easier for you. You don't have to go and search. So there are other platforms, Bill. We just mentioned the ones that we've used and had great service and experience with. But you just mentioned and cited Podbean in that article. And I mentioned also Blubrry. And Blubrry is spelled Blubrry. It's one of those like spellings that, what?
Yeah.
Brry?
Yeah.
There's an E missing. No, it's not a typo. That is exactly how it's spelled.
Well, there's another one here, Buzzsprout, Buzzsprout. You know, so
yeah, and maybe you've heard, as a listener, you may have heard about Blogtalk Radio. It's a very popular one for a number of people. Uses that as well, and there's a feature you mentioned, Bill, that really kind of makes it attractive, right? Which is
Blogtalk Radio is a little bit different than some of the others because they also have a phone-in service. So somebody could phone in a question to you live on the air, or they can allow you to do your interviews via phone on that, and that's interesting. Oh, there's one other we forgot to mention is Podamotic. Yeah. So Podamotic. That's another service that's out there. So there's a variety of other platforms out there besides Libsyn and Spreaker. We'll have links to every single one of them in the show notes of this page, and it'll be a clickable link that you can click and see what fits your personal needs.
And the beautiful thing, as you hear us talking about these, podcast media hosting solutions, we want to give you, again, the minimum viable hosting ideas that you can get started right away. And we're suggesting the tool we use because it's user-friendly. You can get access to that and not have to do much research because we know we can vouch for these two we've mentioned. I know people have used the other ones we mentioned before, but I don't know as much to say, hey, I can vouch for them. So again, you can do the research if you want to, but we're just simply saying if you want to get started right away and later on shift over, then you can go ahead and do that. I think though, Blogtalk Radio, if I'm not mistaken, was you were unable to transport your files from there if you so desire and to move some other place and carry that over. So you might want to check into that. I'm not sure, but I think that's one of the drawbacks that they had. So we've talked about, Bill, the idea of why do we need a hosting platform, and we mentioned about the different reasons. We also talked about when you as a listener, as you're listening in, when you should look into hosting. And we also now mentioned what platforms we use and what's available out there. And I think this really is not a whole lot more that needs to be said on this because I think, again, it's really the solutions. Really, unless you have something else to say, it seems like you have another thing to mention, Bill. But before I mention about what I want him to do about this, what I've heard today.
Well, there is one thing that I do want to bring up that you mentioned, Kingsley, and it was a really good point. These hosting services that are holding your media files, you don't want to be held hostage by accident. So you want to look into the terms of use of each one of these to find out how easy it would be for you to take your files and go somewhere else. Because if it's difficult to do that, then you don't want to be on that hosting service. That is my personal opinion, and I'm going to stick by that. You want to be able to move your files, your media files, wherever you want that best suits your needs at that time. And, I know that with Spreaker and with Libsyn, you can do that. I also know that you can do that with Podbean. I don't know about the others because I have no experience with it. But if one of their conditions is that your files are their files, that's not the place to be.
I think I'm almost certain Blogtalk Radio that's their feature. Drawback is you're unable to export your files from there to another platform. Like when I was on Spreaker, I was able to export the files from there into Libsyn real easy, and that was no problem. So I think that I like that good point. I'm glad you stopped me because I think that is something very important to check into the fine print and make sure that you don't get held like a hostage to your own files once you get going on this. And that's a very important point.
Yeah, and there's one other technical thing I want to get to, and then we can wrap this up. I'm sorry to keep throwing these things at you guys, but
I'm glad you stopped that earlier.
Yeah, they come up when you're thinking about them, and it's best to get it out there. You also want to make sure that whatever service you're putting your files on doesn't do anything stupid to your files that makes the sound worse. There are certain hosting services which compress your file, into a format that you're not used to. So sometimes it's worth, taking a quick read in their terms of use and seeing, do they request your files in a particular format? Do you have to do anything different in your editing with your files before you can put it up there? So that you want to have great audio quality in all your episodes, and the sound. If your episode doesn't sound good, people won't listen. So anytime your hosting service messes with your files, is something that you really don't want. So there you go.
That's a very good point, Bill. I didn't think about that, and you're right. If you have already submitted your file, which has been, balanced out and everything you've been done, and then they compress the file again, you're going to have quality, an issue with your quality of your sound. And I think it's a very good point you mentioned, and I'm glad you squeezed that in just now, because I think it's something I never even thought about while we're talking here. And you might wonder, how come your sound is such the way it is, and that's not how you submitted it? Well, Bill just made the point of what could have happened. So make sure you look into which of these sites you're using to host your audio.
There, I've got that off my chest. Now I feel better, don't you? Don't you?
No, but I'm glad you did that, because if I was listening and I didn't hear that, and I went in and just chose something because somebody else may have told me, I didn't look into it, and I think the reason why you're listening to us, because you trust us. You realize that we've been at this for a while. We're not making any money off these. We have no affiliation with these, so we just want to tell you what we've used. And other people may just tell you other things because they may have affiliations and it's money in their pocket. It's not a whole lot of money, because I know that is not a whole lot of money, but still it's something anyway. Mm-hmm. And we have no vested interest other than the fact that we want you to get started right away. So we mentioned again, Bill. Again, why do we need a hosting platform? When should we look into hosting? When should we look into hosting? What platforms do we use, and other platforms that are out there? And we want to say, hey, you should have no excuse right now, basically, to get this going, because we talked about in episode 19, we mentioned about again, Bill, so they can go back and listen to that. Mm-hmm. Episode 19 was what? Remember?
Yes, it was podcastbyfriday.com/19. And that episode covered powerful behind-the-scene web hosting and website building tools.
Okay. And then 20 was?
The importance of URL and tagline for podcast success.
21
was drag and drop websites for your podcast.
And 22
was
podcast
cover art. Yeah.
And so, my friend, as you're listening and you really hear, hopefully you understand that we want you to get started right away. And the reason why we kind of repeated those numbers, because if you have not listened to those episodes yet, we want you to go back. And we have the links in the show notes in podcastbyfriday.com/23 or 023. But we want you to go back and listen to those episodes, take notes, and get started. Because what happened is we don't want any more procrastination, right? Neither do you. And I know that. That's why you're here. And so we're saying, hey, we want you to get started right away. And we're covering as much as possible, as quickly as possible, so you can have the excuses taken out.
Yep, exactly. And if you're wondering how you get your podcast on any of these hosting sites, well, it's really quite simple. You just have to go sign up and get an account. It's not going to be any simpler, because we're putting the links in the show notes for you to just click the link. It'll take you right to the pages. Pick the one that sounds the best for you and sign up. And
so that's your action step. Go and sign up and let us know what you've done, right? And you can let us know what you have done two ways. One, you can go join us in our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/podcast by Friday. I know you will never be able to guess that.
So we put a link in the show notes.
We put a link in the show notes.
Yeah.
And you can also email us. And where can they email us, Bill?
At podcastbyfriday.com.
So you have no excuse, right?
Yeah.
You have no excuse. And if I hear one more excuse from you, I'm coming to get you.
Uh-oh. Beware, Kingsley's on the rampage. No excuses accepted.
It's over now. It's over.
Yeah. I mean, this is simple. You got one thing to do. Go find your media hosting solution, sign up, and get going. We're almost there, folks. You're almost ready to launch your podcast.
And let us know. We want to celebrate you in your journey, and that's what we're asking you to make sure we know you've done something so we can celebrate you somehow.
Yep, we would love to celebrate your success, talk about your podcast here on our show and you know how you did and you know what you got to say, because you know that's the important thing, is getting more people's voices heard.
And maybe get you on the show and do an interview format to talk about what you've done and where you're at. And it would be good for other people to hear how, by listening to Podcast by Friday, you got your podcast up and running.
Okay. So, Kingsley, where should they go to find this episode?
Go to podcastbyfriday.com/23 or 023.
All right. No excuses. So go get your hosting set up and let us know how it goes, and we would love to hear from you. This is the section of our show where we would normally pause for a word from our sponsor. Now, if you would like to be the sponsor of the Podcast by Friday show, and you have a product or service that you feel would be of benefit to new entrepreneurs starting their new podcast, then contact us at podcast@podcastbyfriday.com, and we'll see if you'd be a good fit.
I like these episodes, Bill.
I do too.
I think what I like about them is it's surprising how much you can talk about these seemingly obvious topics. For us, I mean, obvious for us, it's a course of knowledge, right? What we know. This lady who did this Facebook presentation on Saturday, she said she really stressed at one point, when you think it's like, oh, everybody should know this, everyone don't put it out there and tell them how to do it. Mm-hmm. Don't assume everyone. And she really drove that point home. I'm saying, you know what? It's so true. So when I'm doing these episodes, it's helping me realize that, wait a minute, I could break things down a whole lot simpler. Mm-hmm. So this is really a good exercise for me here. So I'm really gaining as well. So I'm digging them so much.
You know, the curse analogy, you bring that up. It's very true, because I think about where I used to work, my 9 to 5, and we would have an employee there. Let's take the principal clerk. She was in charge of making sure everything was ordered in the station. Everything that we needed was there. And she knew all the vendors, and she knew all the places, and she knew all the people by names. And she'd been doing it for 30 years. And the day she walked out the door, most of that knowledge walked out the door with her. All those relationships, all the things, knowing, hey, these people need 3 weeks of notice before they can get you a product. These guys only need 2. Do you need it in a hurry? That sort of knowledge can go out the door. And if you don't share what you know with someone else, what a waste, what a hard time it was for the person coming in behind them. And, that's kind of the role that we took when we started doing Podcast by Friday, of sharing the knowledge that we've gained in the last few years of doing our podcasts, so that others didn't have to stumble like we did.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And like you said, when she left, all the knowledge left with her.
Yeah. So,
Man.
you don't want to see that. And that's what we're fighting against,
Yeah, I'm really excited that we're doing it this way for our listeners, because I know that we take it for granted because we know it and think everybody does, and everybody does not,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Yeah, I think I may use this at the tail end of the episode because I think it's important enough.
I thought so too. I think that's good. I'm glad you captured that.
Podcast by Friday. Take bold action to create your minimal viable podcast today. Check out new episodes at podcastbyfriday.com or on iTunes or Spreaker.